For millennia, humanity has grappled with a fundamental challenge that would ultimately define the course of civilization itself. While ancient societies were developing rudimentary preservation techniques, they could scarcely have imagined that the simple act of rubbing salt into meat would pave the way for global trade networks. The story of preservation, whether through salt smoke or fermentation, is not merely a tale of culinary innovation. Rather, it represents humanity's relentless struggle against the inexorable decay that threatens all organic matter. Before the advent of modern refrigeration, the ability to preserve food meant the difference between survival and starvation, or prosperity and poverty. The discovery of salt curing was nothing short of revolutionary. By drawing moisture out of the muscle fibers, salt creates an environment that is inhospitable to the bacteria responsible for spoilage. This process, known as osmosis, served as the cornerstone of food security for centuries. As travelers carried these techniques along early trade routes, the practice of curing pork began to take root in various cultures, each adding its own unique flair. Records suggest that as early as 1500 BC, people in ancient China were already curing pork bellies with salt. This practice was born out of necessity, as the humid climate of southern China made meat spoilage an ever-present threat. Had these early innovators not mastered the delicate balance of salt and thyme, many of the recipes we enjoy today might never have existed. They discovered that by applying pressure and salt, the meat became dense, flavorful, and remarkably resistant to rot. Not only did this provide a reliable source of protein during lean winters, but it also allowed for the transport of food over vast distances. The cultural significance of the pig in early Chinese society cannot be overstated, as it was often seen as a symbol of domestic stability and wealth. In fact, the Chinese character for home is composed of a roof over a pig, highlighting how integral these animals were to the social fabric. As we transition from the East to the Mediterranean, we see how the Roman Empire took these concepts to a new level of sophistication. The Romans were legendary for their logistical prowess, and their ability to feed a massive standing army was predicated on preserved rations. They developed a precursor to modern bacon known as petasso, which consisted of a shoulder of pork boiled with dried figs and seasoned with pepper. This Roman delicacy was not just food for the elite, it was a staple that fueled the expansion of an empire. Wealthy Romans would often host lavish banquets, where cured meats were presented as a testament to their refined tastes and vast resources. Never before had a society integrated such complex preservation methods into their everyday culinary identity. While the petasso might differ from the crispy strips we recognize today, the fundamental principle of enhancing flavor through dehydration remained the same. The salt used in this process was so valuable that it was often used as a form of currency, giving rise to the word salary. Consequently, those who controlled the salt mines often controlled the culinary destiny of their respective regions. It is fascinating to observe how a simple chemical reaction transformed a perishable commodity into a high-value asset. During this era, the concept of smoking meat also began to gain prominence alongside salt curing. Smoke contains various phenolic compounds that act as natural antioxidants and antimicrobials, further extending the shelf life of the meat. The combination of salt and smoke created a sensory profile that was both pungent and deeply satisfying. By the time the Roman influence reached Northern Europe, local tribes had already begun adapting these techniques to their own environments. In the Germanic and Celtic lands, the dense forests provided an abundance of wood for smoking, leading to a darker, more intense flavor profile. These northern cultures were particularly adept at utilizing every part of the animal, ensuring that nothing went to waste. The term bacon itself began its linguistic journey during this period, evolving from various Germanic and Old French roots. The word bacco or bacco referred to the back of the pig, which was the primary cut used for curing in medieval Europe. As the linguistic structures of Europe shifted, so too did the terminology surrounding this beloved food. If one were to examine the evolution of the word, one would see a reflection of the migration patterns of early European peoples. Academic vocabulary often describes this as a linguistic convergence, where different dialects influence a single dominant term. In this chapter, you have encountered phrases like inexorable decay and logistical prowess. These expressions are highly effective when you are describing inevitable processes or the ability to manage complex operations. Try incorporating the phrase "pave the way" into your own conversations when discussing how one event makes another possible. Learning these natural collocations will help you sound more like a native speaker while discussing historical transitions. As we move toward the Middle Ages, the production of bacon would move from a survival tactic to a symbol of social status. The ownership of a salt-cured side of pork became a mark of a successful household, particularly among the peasantry. However, the methods of production remained labor-intensive and relied heavily on the seasonal cycles of the year. The pig-killing season in late autumn was a communal event that brought entire villages together in a shared effort of preservation. Without this collective desire for security, the intricate traditions of the smokehouse might have faded into obscurity. Rarely had a single food item been so deeply intertwined with the survival of the common man. The transition from the ancient world to the medieval period brought about a refinement of these techniques that would eventually lead to the idioms we use today. While the Romans had their petasso, the English would soon develop a version of bacon that would conquer the breakfast tables of the world. But before that could happen, the pig would have to survive the complex laws and cultural shifts of the Middle Ages. The next chapter of our story explores how a simple side of meat became the center of a legal tradition that still echoes in our language. Within a few centuries, the act of bringing home the bacon would shift from a literal task to a metaphorical achievement. The stakes were high, as the failure of a cure could mean a winter of hunger for an entire family. Imagine a damp grey morning in a 12th century English village, where the air is thick with the scent of wood smoke. In the corner of a modest cottage, a large slab of salted pork hangs from the rafters, darkened by months of exposure to the hearth. This was not merely a meal, it was a physical manifestation of a family's security against the harshness of winter. If the bacon were to spoil, the household would likely face months of nutritional deprivation. Historians often observe that the presence of cured meat distinguished a thriving homestead from one on the brink of collapse. The humble pig had become the most significant asset for the medieval commoner. During the Middle Ages, the relationship between man and pig was governed by a complex system of traditional rites and seasonal cycles. One of the most vital traditions was pannage, a legal rite that allowed peasants to release their pigs into the royal forests. Between September and November, these animals would forage for acorns and beech mast, which provided the high-fat diet necessary for a successful cure. Had the lord of the manor restricted all forest access, the peasants could not have fattened their swine sufficiently for the winter months. This symbiotic relationship with the land ensured that the walking larder was ready for the traditional autumn slaughter. As the weather turned cold, the community would gather to process the meat, ensuring that every ounce of the animal was put to good use. The fat was rendered into lard, the blood was used for puddings, and the sides of the pig were meticulously salted to become bacon. Rarely was a household considered complete or truly prepared for the year ahead without at least one flitch of bacon in the pantry. A flitch was the term used for a large side of bacon, and owning one was a clear sign of social standing and industriousness. This leads us to one of the most famous cultural traditions in English history, which took place in the town of Great Dunmow. In the year 1104, a local priory established a challenge that would eventually give birth to a phrase we still use today. The prior promised a flitch of bacon to any married couple who could swear before the town and God that they had not regretted their marriage for a year and a day. To win the prize, the couple had to kneel on sharp stones and endure a public trial to prove their domestic harmony. It was an incredibly difficult feat to achieve, and consequently, those who succeeded were held in the highest regard by their neighbours. When a husband returned home with the prize, he was literally and figuratively bringing home the bacon. While we now use this idiom to describe earning a salary, its roots are firmly planted in the soil of medieval Essex. The flitch was not just a reward, it was a luxury that most families could only dream of possessing in such abundance. By examining this tradition, we gain insight into how food served as a bridge between legal contracts and social prestige. Throughout this period, the methods for curing bacon were refined through trial and error, often passed down through generations. The meat was typically rubbed with a mixture of salt honey and various herbs like sage or rosemary to enhance the flavour profile. Smoking the meat over specific woods such as oak or applewood added a layer of complexity that was highly sought after. Nevertheless, the process remained a precarious one, as improper storage could lead to the growth of dangerous moulds. People had to be vigilant, constantly monitoring the humidity and temperature of their storage areas to prevent loss. In the kitchens of the era, bacon was rarely eaten as a standalone dish, like we see on modern breakfast plates. Instead, it was often boiled in a large communal pot, known as a pottage, where it seasoned vegetables and grains. The salty fat would melt into the broth, providing essential calories and flavour to an otherwise bland vegetarian diet. For the working class, bacon was the primary source of animal protein, as fresh meat was often too expensive for daily consumption. It is interesting to note that even the aristocracy valued bacon, though they often preferred it prepared with more exotic spices. If a traveller were to stop at a medieval inn, they would likely be served a thick slice of bacon alongside a flustered piece of bread. This simple combination provided the sustained energy required for long journeys across the treacherous roads of Europe. As the centuries progressed, the linguistic influence of bacon continued to permeate the English language in unexpected ways. Beyond bringing home the bacon, phrases like "to save one's bacon" began to appear in the common vernacular. This particular expression, referring to escaping a dangerous situation, highlights how valuable the meat was to one's survival. To lose your bacon was not just a culinary mishap. It was a personal catastrophe that could lead to financial ruin. In this chapter, you have heard sophisticated terms such as nutritional deprivation and social prestige. These academic words are excellent for describing the impact of resources on human well-being and status. You also encountered the phrasal verb to pass down, which is essential for discussing traditions and heritage. Notice how we use the phrase to be held in the highest regard to describe someone who is deeply respected. By mastering these structures, you can express complex social ideas with the nuance of a highly proficient speaker. As we move toward the end of the medieval era, the production of bacon began to shift from the home to the marketplace. Towns were growing and specialized butchers began to appear, offering cured meats to those who no longer raised their own livestock. This transition marked the beginning of a commercialization process that would eventually lead to the industrial factories of the North. However, the artisanal soul of the craft remained intact, even as the scale of production began to expand. The world was on the cusp of a major transformation that would redefine how humanity produced and consumed food. Within a few generations, the invention of the Wiltshire cure in England would revolutionize the industry forever. This new method would allow for the mass production of bacon, making it accessible to the growing urban population. But as the process became more efficient, some feared that the traditional flavors of the smokehouse would be lost to history. The struggle between quality and quantity was about to become the defining theme of the next century. For centuries, the quality of your morning meal depended entirely on the skill of your local butcher. If he failed to balance the salt and smoke, your food would be ruined or worse, dangerous to consume. By the mid-1700s, this unpredictability began to clash with the needs of a rapidly growing and hungry urban population. One man in Wiltshire saw this tension not as a problem, but as an opportunity to rethink food production entirely. His solution would trigger an industrial chain reaction that still shapes how we eat in the modern world. Some historians argue that the true industrialization of food began not in a laboratory, but in the small English town of Collocations. In the year 1770, John Harris opened the world's first commercial bacon factory, marking a departure from centuries of home-based curing. Before his intervention, curing was a slow, seasonal process that varied wildly from one village to the next. Harris introduced the Wiltshire cure, a specialized method that utilized a liquid brine instead of the traditional dry salt rub. By submerging the pork in a salt solution, he could ensure that the cure penetrated the meat more evenly and significantly faster. This innovation allowed for a level of consistency that had never before been achieved in the history of meat preservation. Scale changed everything. Not only did Harris streamline the production process, but he also paved the way for the year-round availability of bacon. As the Industrial Revolution gained momentum, the demand for high-calorie, easily transportable food skyrocketed among factory workers. The pig, once a symbol of rural self-sufficiency, was now being funneled into a centralized system of mass production. If the railroad networks had not expanded during this period, the centralized meatpacking model might have failed to reach its potential. Trains allowed for the rapid transport of live animals and finished products connecting distant farms to the heart of bustling cities. Consequently, the local butcher found himself competing with large-scale operations that could offer lower prices and standardized quality. This era marked a significant shift in the social fabric as consumers began to prioritize convenience over artisanal tradition. Across the Atlantic, the American meatpacking industry was experiencing an even more dramatic transformation. In cities like Chicago, the stockyards became massive disassembly lines, where every part of the animal was utilized with surgical precision. By the late 19th century, the American meatpacking giants were exporting millions of pounds of bacon to Europe. The scale of these operations was so immense that it redefined the global economic landscape of the food industry. Rarely had an industry evolved so quickly from a localized craft to a global juggernaut. However, as production increased, a new challenge emerged. How could companies convince consumers to trust a product they didn't see being made? The answer lay in the birth of branding and the psychology of modern marketing. In the early 20th century, a German immigrant in Chicago named Oscar Mayer realized that packaging was the key to consumer confidence. Before this realization, bacon was typically sold in large slabs that the consumer had to slice themselves at home. In 1924, Oscar Mayer introduced a revolutionary product, pre-sliced packaged bacon. This simple invention was a masterpiece of marketing and engineering, as it removed the labor and guesswork from the breakfast routine. By displaying the product in a clear branded package, he provided a visual guarantee of quality and hygiene. Standardization was the new gold standard. Housewives across the nation embraced this convenience, and bacon soon became a permanent fixture of the all-American breakfast. It is worth noting that this shift also involved a collaboration with the public relations pioneer Edward Bernays. To boost sales, Bernays famously promoted the idea that a hearty breakfast of eggs and bacon was essential for good health. If he hadn't successfully lobbied the medical community to endorse this diet, the American breakfast might look very different today. Through these strategic campaigns, bacon was transformed from a humble peasant staple into a modern cultural icon. In this segment of our story, you have encountered terms such as centralized system and streamline the process. These academic collocations are perfect for discussing efficiency in business technology or history. You also heard the phrase, the gold standard, which refers to the best or most reliable example of something. In terms of grammar notice, the use of the third conditional, if the railroad networks had not expanded, the model might have failed. This structure is invaluable for analyzing historical what-if scenarios and expressing regrets or hypothetical outcomes. As the industry grew, the focus shifted from simple survival to the optimization of flavor and shelf life. Chemical additives like sodium nitrate were introduced to give bacon its signature pink colour and to prevent the growth of botulism. While these additives ensured safety and aesthetic appeal, they also sowed the seeds of future health controversies. The culture of convenience was reaching its peak, but the artisanal methods of the past were beginning to fade. By the middle of the 20th century, the supermarket had become the primary battlefield for bacon brands. Marketing experts worked tirelessly to create a sense of nostalgia, often using imagery of traditional farms to sell factory-made products. This tension between industrial reality and pastoral fantasy would define the food industry for decades to come. Nevertheless, the popularity of bacon remained unshakable as it had become deeply embedded in the identity of the middle class. The story of bacon is in many ways the story of how humanity learned to mass-produce taste. Yet, as we will see in the next part, this period of dominance would soon face its greatest challenge from the scientific community. Within a few decades, new research into nutrition would threaten to topple the bacon empire from its breakfast throne. The noble experiment of mass production had succeeded, but the health consequences were about to take center stage. In our next chapter, we will explore the great decline of the 1970s and the surprising way the industry fought back. The battle for the breakfast table was far from over. By the 1970s, the undisputed king of the breakfast table suddenly found itself on the defensive. For decades, families had consumed bacon without a second thought, viewing it as an essential component of a healthy, vigorous life. However, a wave of new scientific research began to cast a long shadow over the meatpacking industry. One popular theory suggests that the rise of heart disease in the West was directly linked to the consumption of animal fats. Records vary on the exact timing, but many historians argue that this era marked the beginning of the low-fat revolution. Suddenly, the very streaks of fat that had been prized for centuries were being stigmatized as dangerous toxins. The industry was facing an existential crisis that would require more than just clever packaging to solve. The decline was swift and devastating for many traditional producers. As public health campaigns intensified, consumers began to shy away from anything containing high levels of saturated fat and sodium. Not only did sales of bacon plummet, but the cultural image of the product also shifted from wholesome to harmful. Rarely had a staple food item experienced such a dramatic fall from grace in such a short period. The fear was not just limited to fat. The use of nitrates for preservation also came under intense scientific scrutiny. Reports emerged suggesting that these additives could form carcinogenic compounds when cooked at high temperatures. Had the industry ignored these findings, the government might have banned cured meats entirely during the late 20th century. Consequently, producers were forced to innovate, developing new methods to reduce nitrate levels while maintaining food safety. During this period of uncertainty, the industry realized it needed a complete paradigm shift in its marketing strategy. They launched the famous "Pork the Other White Meat" campaign to distance their product from the negative associations of red meat. By positioning pork as a lean, versatile alternative to chicken, they hoped to win back the health-conscious middle class. The campaign was a masterstroke of psychological manipulation as it effectively rebranded an entire category of food. Nevertheless, the bacon portion of the pig still struggled to find its place in this new low-fat world. It was during the late 1980s that a few visionary chefs began to experiment with bacon as a flavor enhancer rather than a main course. They discovered that adding small amounts of high-quality bacon could elevate the sensory profile of almost any dish. This fat as flavor movement started in high-end restaurants, but quickly began to trickle down to the fast food industry. Hardline reality, the consumer's biological craving for salt and fat, eventually proved stronger than the fear of dietary guidelines. By the early 2000s, the tide had turned completely, leading to an era of bacon mania that few could have predicted. Fast food chains began to realize that adding bacon to a burger allowed them to increase the price significantly with very little extra cost. This phenomenon, often referred to as the baconization of everything, saw the ingredient appearing in ice cream, chocolate, and even cocktails. The internet played a crucial role in this resurgence, as bacon became a meme, a symbol of rebellion against the restrictive health trends of previous decades. Some social commentators argue that this obsession was a collective desire to return to a more authentic and indulgent way of eating. In this chapter, you have encountered advanced academic terms like existential crisis and paradigm shift. These phrases are invaluable when you are discussing major turning points in history, business, or science. You also heard the phrasal verb to shy away from, which means to avoid something because you are nervous or frightened. Notice the use of the inversion. Not only did sales plummet, but the cultural image also shifted. Using this structure helps you emphasize the second part of your sentence, making your speech sound more sophisticated and persuasive. Try to use trickle down in your own sentences to describe how trends move from an elite group to the general public. As the demand for bacon skyrocketed, the industry faced a new challenge: the rise of the artisan movement. A new generation of consumers was no longer satisfied with the thin, watery slices found in mass-market supermarkets. They began to seek out small-batch producers who used traditional dry curing methods and heritage breeds of pigs. This shift represented a rejection of industrial standardization in favor of complex flavors and ethical farming practices. Farmers who had been on the verge of bankruptcy found a new lucrative market for their high-quality pork. The conflict between industrial efficiency and artisanal quality had reached a new, more profitable equilibrium. Yet even as bacon enjoyed this unprecedented popularity, the environmental impact of large-scale pig farming began to emerge as a major concern. The massive CAFOs, or concentrated animal feeding operations, were being criticized for their ecological footprint and animal welfare standards. The story of bacon was once again entering a period of intense public debate and social friction. The next decade would determine whether bacon could maintain its status in an era of increasing environmental awareness. One thing was certain: the cultural bond between humanity and this salty, smoky treat was deeper than anyone had realized. Reflecting on this era, we see how a product can survive even the most severe scientific and social pressure. The takeaway is that human taste is often more resilient than the dietary laws meant to govern it. But the most fascinating part of the story is how the industry began to look beyond the pig entirely. Within a few years, the development of plant-based and lab-grown alternatives would challenge the very definition of what bacon actually is. That transition would mark the beginning of a whole new frontier in food technology. As we enter the third decade of the 21st century, the cultural status of bacon has reached a level of unprecedented saturation. What was once a humble preservation technique has transformed into a global phenomenon that transcends culinary boundaries. From artisanal smokehouses in rural Vermont to high-tech laboratories in Silicon Valley, the pursuit of the perfect strip of bacon continues to drive innovation. However, this modern obsession is not without its complexities as society grapples with the environmental and ethical costs of mass production. One popular theory suggests that our current infatuation with bacon is a reaction to the highly processed artificial flavors of the late 20th century. Some experts argue that in a world of digital abstraction, the smoky, salty, and tangible reality of bacon provides a sense of primal comfort. The journey from a survival ration to a cultural icon is now entering its most challenging and technologically advanced chapter. In the modern marketplace, the bacon mania of the early 2000s has matured into a sophisticated niche market for connoisseurs. Never before have consumers been so invested in the specific details of how their meat is raised, slaughtered, and cured. This shift has given rise to the craft bacon movement, where small batch producers focus on heritage breeds like the Berkshire or Tamworth pig. These breeds, which were nearly pushed to extinction by industrial farming, are prized for their higher fat content and complex flavor profiles. By utilizing traditional dry curing methods that take weeks rather than hours, these artisans are reclaiming a lost culinary heritage. Had the industrial model completely erased these traditions, the modern culinary landscape would be far less diverse and flavorful. Consequently, many high-end restaurants now treat bacon with the same reverence as a fine wine or a rare cheese. Waiters often explain the specific wood used for smoking, be it applewood hickory or cherry, to an increasingly educated clientele. Yet alongside this artisanal revival, a much larger and more urgent conflict is brewing in the global food system. The sheer scale of global bacon consumption has created an environmental footprint that many scientists believe is unsustainable. Industrial pig farming is one of the leading contributors to water pollution and greenhouse gas emissions in several countries. Furthermore, the ethical quandaries surrounding animal welfare in large-scale operations have led to a surge in activism and legal reform. As a result, a significant segment of the population is beginning to look for alternatives that do not involve traditional livestock. This has paved the way for the Great Alternative Race, where food scientists are attempting to recreate the bacon experience using plants. Replicating the specific texture of bacon, the contrast between the crispy fat and the chewy meat is considered the holy grail of food engineering. Some companies are utilizing mushrooms, while others are experimenting with seaweed to mimic the smoky umami flavor of the original. While early versions were often criticized for being rubbery or bland, the technology is improving at an exponential rate. In the near future, many consumers may find it difficult to distinguish between high-quality plant-based bacon and the real thing. Beyond plant-based solutions, the frontier of cultivated meat offers an even more radical possibility for the future. By growing real animal cells in a controlled environment, scientists can produce meat without the need for raising or slaughtering animals. If this technology becomes commercially viable, it could eliminate the environmental and ethical burdens of the traditional meat industry. Imagine a world where the savory taste of bacon is available to everyone, regardless of their dietary or ethical restrictions. The culture adapted fast to the digital age, and it is now adapting to the age of biological innovation. In this final chapter, we have used academic expressions such as unprecedented saturation and ethical quandaries. These phrases are highly effective for describing complex societal issues and the overwhelming presence of a trend. You also encountered the phrasal verb to give rise to, which is a formal way to describe how one thing causes another to happen. Notice the use of the conditional if this technology becomes, it could eliminate, which helps you discuss future possibilities. The term Holy Grail is a common idiom used to describe something that is highly sought after but very difficult to achieve. By incorporating these linguistic tools, you can discuss the intersection of technology ethics and culture with precision. As we look back on the long history of bacon, we see a story of human ingenuity and our enduring relationship with the natural world. From the salt-cured bellies of ancient China to the lab-grown strips of tomorrow, our desire for this specific flavour remains constant. The evolution of bacon mirrors the evolution of humanity itself. Our migrations, our industrial triumphs, and our current search for sustainability. While the methods of production will undoubtedly continue to change, the essence of what bacon represents will likely endure. It remains a symbol of domesticity, a reward for hard work, and a testament to the power of simple ingredients. The takeaway from this journey is that even the most basic foods can tell a profound story about who we are as a species. But as one door closes on the era of industrial dominance, another opens onto a future defined by conscious consumption. The next great transformation of the breakfast table will be driven by a generation that values both tradition and the health of the planet. Within a few years, your morning meal might be produced in a way that would seem like science fiction to your ancestors. The taste of history is always evolving. That is the true legacy of the pig and the smokehouse.